Hello and welcome back to the third and final part of the Word of Blake series of lore. I'll just start my timer here so I can keep a track of the time. Otherwise, I will just bang on and on and on, and no one will care about what I have to say. So, if you've been following along, we talked about who Blake is and what he's had to say. We've talked about how the Word of Blake spread and gained political power. And where we left off was that the Star League has just disintegrated, and because of the way that the Word of Blake leadership has really used and manipulated the mythology and the religious side of things, their followers sort of were not sure how to react to the idea that one of these key factors has sort of disintegrated and impacted their foreseen sort of prophecy. And the faction leaders had to choose between whether they were going to reinterpret what they'd been saying and proselytizing so dogmatically, or whether they were going to hold to account those who have sort of shifted their fate, and they chose the violence. They chose the violent method. So, shortly after this disintegration of the Star League was formalized, the Word of Blake warships appeared in the key systems of Tharkad and New Avalon, right, in the Federated Commonwealth. So one is in the Lyrian systems, one is in the Davian systems, and immediately broadcast threats that if the nation should not immediately rejoin the Star League, they would be forced to act. Now, I don't know how much you know about psychology, but generally speaking, and this is a good tip for anyone, if you threaten someone to do something, they usually choose not to do what you want them to do, right? Not what you're threatening them to do. The threat has to be very significant in order to make that happen. And this is very true when it comes to things like nations and terrorism and attacks like that. And so when threatened, the leaders became entirely obstinate. They just we're not going to move. We're not going to act. In fact, if anything, it sharpened their resolve to definitely remain out of the Star League for as long as possible. They even refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the faction of Word of Blake. They're like, well, who are you? You're not even a real Star League member. You don't get to make those kind of threats. You and your bunch of spaceships, who cares? And the Blakeists were sort of... The only way you can deal with that if someone refuses to acknowledge your threat is to go through with your threat, right? And so they responded immediately by orbital bombardment, and they dispatched ground troops, and they just attacked the cities. This was a heinous attack, and this is exactly how it was viewed by the other factions. Orbital bombardment has been prohibited by the Ares Convention, and here they are just, going crazy, attacking cities, civilian targets, the political leadership of the planets. These are the capital cities of their nations, right? And they're just going bananas attacking it. And so Word of Blake was sort of forced to say, well, if you disagree with our actions, then obviously you disagree with our cause, and you've become enemies of our cause. So you can see how this is just starting to spiral more and more out of control. It's like, a game of poker where the bluffs just keep getting more and more extreme. The Jihad that ensued spanned close to a decade, right? The violence just got worse and worse. They just continued to spread those attacks, attacking other people. But during this time, countless assaults were waged by them to try and trigger things. But, that violence that they, created, whilst that was very heinous and very extreme, that wasn't the most scary part about the Jihad, right? That's not what is causing all the problems. What happens is it's their most villainous threat. It's not about the weapons that they're using, but the way that they're using them, right? Their first attack was to white out all the HPG networks. So in the past, Comstar has blacked out the networks, and what inevitably happens is people fix them and bypass the circuits of command and things like that, and are able to send messages. So what they did was, instead of making it so that they can't transmit, was that they're constantly transmitting, and they're constantly transmitting to every other HPG station. So it's just this bombardment of a constant message being sent, burning up all the power, but really significantly causing you can't receive or transmit any message when this is happening, just because there's this data overload, right? So this was very superior to the previous sort of methods, and it was very significant because it meant that they could still send messages if people people within their organization knew how to decode what was legit and what was not, right? So they'd be able to tell, okay, well, at this time we're going to send this message and it will be very clear, and they'll send it out and it'll happen, right? They had communications, but others didn't. So that's a really key part of it. Word of Blake forces will also spring out of nowhere. So if you remember, in the past they were waiting, they were biding their time, slowly but surely moving one troop here, one troop there, right? Rather than having 500 troops all turn up at once, it was like, okay, well, once a week we'll send a group of 5 people in, and if we do that for the next 2 years, then by the time we've ready to attack, we'll have had battalions ready there and waiting, and all this time they've just been there, holidaying or doing their jobs or whatever. And these hidden armies that had been sleeper cells there for decades, some of them, just waiting for the call to action. So suddenly they'd receive that message, they'd hear, okay, this is our code word, this is our time to act, and they'd suddenly have this Word of Blake army on a planet without even having a ship enter a sector, because they'd always been on the planet. And that blew people's minds. They had no idea what to do. The other thing is, how do you identify someone's religion, right? Now, if you were a sleeper agent, you could be a secret Word of Blake worshipper, and you could rise to the top of a political structure. You could rise to the top of a very important, crucial infrastructure organization, right? You could be scattered throughout the major houses, right? So they had all these different secret Blakeists who'd already been there spying on people and sending the information back. And what they started to do was get these worshippers to start, sort of manipulating the people who they were around, the important leaders of the time, right? And saying, well, even though the Word of Blake is attacking Tharkad right now, there's no reason, for the Draconis guys to not maybe also attack Tharkad, They're slowly building up all these different things. So not only was everyone fighting the Word of Blake, but now they were also all fighting themselves, right? And this created chaos. Absolute chaos. And the major houses, obviously, they didn't require a lot of pushing. Like, there's a bit more space there, a bit more resources to go and grab. They didn't require a lot of manipulation. They jumped straight onto it. And so they sort of seized this opportunity to sow complete chaos, right? Throughout the entire inner sphere. And this, in turn, weakened their defenses, right? So they would organize for someone to get a false sense of security, no attacks for a long time, all the rest of this stuff. We've moved on to the next target, whatever, or maybe some minor attacks that then stop. And the opportunity would arise for them to go and attack a neighbor, attack another house. And once their forces had gone to that, then the Word of Blake would sneak in through the back door, come to a key location that was very vulnerable, capitalize on the complete lack of defense, and just orbitally bombard the planet. Often this meant attacking capital cities of key industry directly, right? And these were attacks on civilian targets, civilian companies that are not run by a military. And so these attacks were against the Ares Convention. There are some survivors in the law who have reported the use of nuclear weapons. Again, some of the law disputes this. It just depends on where you get your sources from. But regardless, total destruction ensued. All of the, I guess before I move on to the next part, it's important to come back to their initial mentality, right? What is their mindset? They want technological control, right? That's what Comstar had. That was Comstar's major power. They wanted this technological control. And the only way to do that is to get rid of everyone from having the technological control. So for Comstar, they did that to themselves in the fourth succession war, or in the first three succession wars, right? So Word of Blake is trying to be able to get that enigmatic, mysterious, sort of supernatural level of technological advantage by destroying what everyone else has and preserving what they have for themselves, right? So this is where we come into the next stage, basically. And we're pretty much at the end of it. So the Jihad comes to an end in 3081. And that happens when Devlin Stone and David Lear, so David Lear is like an heir to the Liao throne, they combine their efforts and they crush the established Blakist war machine by striking at their heart in terror. Stone's coalition retakes the fortified Terror. But before that can happen, right, we need to understand who is Stone, how does he get this power. So Devlin Stone was originally being, sort of the first mention of him is he's a prisoner of war. And he's in a camp that's designed for re-education. So I don't know if you're familiar with what the Nazis did, and you can see a great example of it on Lost. There's a few other good movies that sort of show this idea that you're retraining people to become your own soldiers, right? And so he and a small group of other prisoners, this included David Lear, who's a Liao heir, they held this insurrection within the camp, and this became the first battle of many military campaigns. So he sort of gathers resources there, and then he's got that, so he takes it to the next planet, and he takes it to the next planet, and he slowly gathers more and more resources. He ends up helping out a lot of the leaders of the Inner Sphere, some of the significant clan khans, and by 3073, Stone presents this plan to Comstar, to the Precentor Marshal, which at that time is Victor Steiner Davian, Victor Ian Steiner Davian. How many names do you want, mate? Just pick one. Fire out. So, the current Comstar leader. And he explained that his new philosophy would create this grounds to overthrow the Blakists by targeting their socio-political beliefs, right? And targeting their civilians particularly, right? So his idea was sort of described as militant socialism keyed to altruism. Now, that's as a sociologist, I can tell you that's that's a rough description. But basically, this is what he's talking about, right? He saw an opportunity to reform the older government. Officials and authorities would cease to control their assets. Instead, it would be owned by the public, right? So the public would own all the assets, all the buildings, all the resources, all the infrastructure. Not a company, not a great house, but the public, in the public interest, right? Public service would be rewarded. Corruption would be punished. Greed was very frowned upon in this idea. Weapons were to be government controlled and sort of restricted. And the idea was that they'd take these ideas to the people who had sort of been already downtrodden by the Blakist sort of regime, and try to present this idea to them. And it was sort of he took this idea, and eventually he convinced all of the great houses to offer some of their worlds closest to Terra in order to create a new nation that controlled the space around the core of Terra, right? And this would cut off the Blakist commanders from the rest of the galaxy, and then they could shortly after take the fight to retake Terra, and they did that, and they won, and the Jihad was ended. Now, I don't want to gloss over, because I'll get accused of glossing over stuff. I don't want to gloss over the fact that Liao were not down with this plan, and Devlin Stone said, well, you know what? I'm just going to take your planet. Screw you. So he just took the planets by military force, right? So again, that is key to the story. And all the other houses were like, yeah, we're glad we didn't, piss him off. So he does this. They take over Terra. They build this republic. And the public takes over control of many of the core worlds, right? You got to remember, again, that these, the things that he's doing are very similar to sort of the philosophy that the Blakeists were following the word of Blake 4, right? The idea that, we don't want this, divided houses. We want this neutrality. We want this core thing. So these days, I say these days, in the current law, there's very few word of Blake supporters that still float around, right? They're very outdated. They're often seen as, responsible for this brutal decade of murder. They're often seen for creating a dark age, which is exactly what ensues after the Republic sort of starts rebuilding itself. They've destroyed all these technology. They've, established exactly what they said they were going to establish. It's also hard for them to, I guess, take reprisals because there's a lack of weapons in the Dark Age. So it's hard to have a grassroots-based military uprising if all the weapons are very heavily restricted and mandated by the government. It's hard to do that. There are still several Blakeist cells that remain active. Most of these belong exclusively to Comstar, almost exclusively to Comstar. They actually play a lot of key roles in the ROM espionage division. So the Comstar's, Secret Service, their espionage division. Most of the former Blakeists are either dead, or they're from, all the fighting in the Jihad, or perhaps they've reformed back to normal society and have started supporting the Republic. The hardest community that was hit by the Jihad was the Free Worlds League, right? So by far, they had the most Word of Blake supporters because the Word of Blake had been there for such a long time. They already had a lot of sympathizers with the Word of Blake when they first, received the refuge from them. And so the sanctuary from them. So they managed to spread their philosophy quite significantly throughout that nation. And what ended up happening was that when Word of Blake put the call for action out, a lot of the military forces sort of turned their back on the Free Worlds League for Word of Blake, this much bigger idea. And so as a result, a lot of the military was not there to defend. Just simply not there to defend. And as a result, the nations have sort of disintegrated from the Free Worlds League. And if you look at the map as it sort of changes, you can see exactly how that sort of happened these days. But that's pretty much it for Word of Blake. That's where they're at today. There's not a lot of people. There's a lot of devastation. And the Dark Age is the Dark Age, I guess. And that's Word of Blake. I'm pretty sure I covered everything. We discussed the Jihad. Now, obviously, the Jihad went on for 10 years, more or less. So if there's anything that I have missed that you really would like to hear about, any specific battles, whatever, let me know. But I think that sort of covers it. I think a lot of people don't understand why did this Jihad happen? And I think a lot of it is just spiraling out of control like crazy. Anyway, so that's it for this guide. This is the third part of 3. So I think we're done with the Word of Blake. Unless there's any questions, we'll come back to those. Next week, I'm going to try and set up maybe the Clan War stuff. We might do the Clan War stuff. Just because I haven't done enough clan stuff. And I'm kind of getting back into Battletech doing these. It's starting to spark my interest again. So we'll talk a bit about the clans in the next video. If you have any suggestions for future videos, please put them in the comments, and I'll see you then. Ciao for now, and yeah, see you later.